Every action has a reaction.
It's so nice to be having this conversation with you.
The universe, you might look at the universe and think of it this way. It works like a GPS. The universe is both self-organizing and self-correcting.
I know there's this term people use, big T, little t.
Nobody had this concept of stay in your lane. Nobody said, well, your wellness, your spirituality and religion, your politics. We're multidimensional people. And that has really divided us and separated us from aspects of ourselves.
I have this plant that I'm like, feel connected to. It was starting to die and I brought it back to life and I'm like, okay, now this plant has this consciousness and I feel responsible for it. So it's like you just go down this path.
In youth you learn, in age you understand. You know, when you're younger, thinking about the future, when you're older, it's like, oh my God, what did I just go through over the last 50 years? We're living at a time where one world is crumbling and another is being born.
To be able to have this conversation is amazing. It's so nice to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you.
And I feel like we are in a time right now more than ever where people are looking for connection, purpose, spirituality. So to be sitting here and having this conversation with you is really incredible because I feel that you are this figure to a lot of people that's so almost just something we would aspire to, but not necessarily attainable. It's almost as if you're this enlightened being that is a little unreachable. So to be able to have this conversation is amazing.
Well, thank you. I actually don't think that's how people perceive me, and that's okay. I think people actually have seen me walking my own journey, stumbling a few times, and I think the zeitgeist of this moment isn't so much the perfect master. I mean, I think there are perfect enlightened masters, but nobody's thinking that I'm one. No. And I think that the zeitgeist that I'm part of is somebody sincerely trying. You know what I'm saying? I think there's a lot of oops, but honest, and I think that kind of speaks to where all of us are right now.
No, it's nice to hear. Maybe it's just me that maybe I tend to just like idolize people that I respect so much in this space and learn from. So it's actually a great thing. It's always nice for me to hear it from the person too. I'm like, wait, are you still learning? Or is it like you know all the lessons, but you're just reminded as you go because you're so deep in this work?
Life is like, it's like going to the gym. You never get to stop. You never get to look at yourself in the mirror at the gym and say, okay, I don't have to work out anymore. Because the moment you stop, gravity starts pulling down on your muscles. Well, there's internal gravity too of anger, frustration, fear, negativity, whatever it is. So no matter what we achieve in life, and all of us have our moments where we get there, all of us on a sincere path, in our relationships, we need to give ourselves credit. But then you fall off the spiritual wagon. It's about, the enlightened master just gets someplace 24/7. That all of us on a sincere path probably get there some. It's easy enough to be loving when people are being kind to you. It's easy enough to be generous when you have stuff. So, I think that the way life works is just like when you're in school. If you finish the 6th grade, the 7th grade, it's going to be a little harder. And I think that there is an urgency to this moment, much as you were saying. This is a historic moment, an inflection point. We're either going up or we're going down. There's no more cruising in neutral. And so I think that the lessons are coming kind of hard and heavy for people and fast. And I don't know anyone who's not experiencing their own little microcosm of the intensity and the struggles of this moment. And I think for myself, in terms of my own work, I think if there's anything unique about me, it's that there's nothing unique here. It's my struggles and my opportunities, they've all been more than not garden variety, no matter how much it looks on the outside. And I think when we really talk to one another and are honest with one another, we find that that's true of all of us. We're all going through the same stuff, just in different forms.
I'm curious, what do you define as this moment? Like in this moment now, do you think this was the same the last 30 years, the last 10 years?
This is a profound moment of historic phase transition First of all, it's the beginning of a millennium. We've just started to really take that in. So first of all, the mindset of any century is different than the mindset of the last one. The 20th century mindset was different than the 19th, and the 21st is different than the 20th. The 20th century mindset was very mechanistic. It was based on Newtonian physics. It was the idea that the world is a big machine, and if you have a problem, you just tweak a piece of the machine. The 21st century is far more holistic and whole person. We realize, there's an inner life as well as an outer life. And the inner life is causal to the outer life. So you can't just treat symptoms and try to tweak pieces of the machine. We're beginning to recognize that societal change has to be integrative, just like medical change. The integrative paradigm means you have to cultivate health, not just treat sickness. And even if sickness happens, obviously, I know this is much of your field, then we have to use internal as well as external remedies and factors included in trying to heal. I think that's where we are as a civilization. Now, I think that people who are in their 20s now, I think Gen Z is a particularly meaningful generation because they're not 20th century people. They're not 20th century thinkers. So they just have a natural understanding of a more holistic, whole person perspective, but that's creating, obviously, at this time, some tension because many people don't understand them and they don't understand those other people. Now, in addition to that, in terms of our entire civilization, we're living at a time where one world is crumbling and another is being born. So the world that is crumbling, it is a consequence of a lot of malfeasance and irresponsibility on the part of several generations. But what's frightening is that some of the good stuff seems to be falling apart as well. So we have this simultaneous phenomenon, one world falling apart, another world, the Arundhati Roy phrase about a new world, another world is struggling to be born. So I think we're living at a time where we are called to be both death doulas and birth doulas. Death doulas in the sense that, yeah, some things are going to have to change. We have to, for instance, go from a war economy to a peace economy, or we will all die. We have to go from a dirty economy to a clean economy, or we will all die. We are at a point, just like we learned as kids in school. If a species gets to a point where its behavior is maladaptive for its survival, one of two things is going to happen. It's either going to go extinct or evolve. And it evolves when a mutation occurs, where some member of the species demonstrates a better way. And then in the species that evolve and survive, the entire species starts moving in that direction. So we're living at one of those moments. We honestly, I say one of those moments, I don't think there's ever even been a moment quite like this on a global scale. You change, or it is unreasonable to assume the survival of your great-grandchildren. So but the changes, I think, and this is very important for us from a spiritual perspective and from any perspective if we're conscious, we have to be wise. We have to be sober about all this. We have to be deeply responsible, harmless. Like you and I are talking right a week before a presidential election. There's so much concern. I was reading before I got here about, in a couple of places already, somebody has set fire to voting boxes. So I think a commitment to harmlessness and to an open heart and to a genuine practice of nonviolence, which means a capacity to love even those we might not like, and to be respectful towards even those with whom we do not agree. Those personal characteristics are absolutely imperative right now if we're to endure this moment and to survive this moment, to transform this moment, which is, I think, why we were born.
You know, that just brings me right into a part of your book, The Mystic Jesus, because it's something you talk about, which is loving your enemies. And I think we've all heard this phrase in some form or another, but I think the importance you lay on it. And my question is, if we want to forgive someone, if we want to love our enemies, how does someone actually do that in real life? Because if I'm closing my eyes and meditating and saying, there's a few people in my life I can think about that I'm not fond of. And do I close my eyes and just say, God, please send them love? But what if also I have these conflicting feelings of anger or whatever? If you keep saying it more, does it change how you feel on the inside? Because sometimes you feel like you're being fake when you're saying it.
Well, there's a lot of fake it till you make it in spiritual growth. There is.
Okay.
But in the Course in Miracles, the operative phrase is, I am willing. So stuff has to come up in spiritual growth, just like in physical. There's a detox is something where you can't just press stuff down. It has to come up in order to be released. So you don't pretend, I like the person, really I do. You say, I am pissed, but I'm willing not to be. I am angry, but I am willing not to be. And that willingness, the Course in Miracles says your good intentions are not enough, but your willingness is everything. Now, once you know the rules of consciousness, there are objective, discernible rules of the inner life, just like there are objective, discernible rules of the external world. Every action has a reaction. Now, the universe, you might look at the universe and think of it this way. It works like a GPS. The universe is both self-organizing and self-correcting. One love, a moment of love, will follow another moment of love, will follow another moment of love. If you or I deviate from love, as long as even one person in the system holds to love anyway, then the system will recalibrate and we will get a chance to get back on track. So let's say I'm angry at someone because they behaved in a way that was unloving to me, okay? Now, on a human level, I might be right. They might have betrayed me, they might have undermined me, they might have sabotaged me. I understand. And you apparently do too. I mean, we're human, right? Okay, if I hold on to the anger, the Course in Miracles would say, I am delaying the moment of my own new beginning. In other words, I am attached to what they did to me. That's why I'm angry. So as to the extent to which I'm attached to what they did to me, I identify with what they did to me. I am programming into the universe that I am at the effect of what they did to me. But if I realize, well, they did it on a human level, but as the Course in Miracles says, you were not created to be at the effect of lovelessness within yourself or others. If I am willing to hold to that, to know that the essence of who I am, the Christ consciousness, is not at the effect of that, then all effects of what they did become nullified. But it's a process. We're not those enlightened masters. And, it's probably not best to have lunch yet. This doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to talk to them. Well, we don't know when. But it is a willingness to get off that wheel of suffering. And the only person being hurt by our holding on to the unforgiveness is ourselves. But, even as we say this, I'm thinking of this one person, and, it's a process. I get it. I get it, and I have moments.
The willingness really just stuck with me.
That's what the Course says. I am willing to see this differently.
I think I got through maybe 3 months of the Course and then stopped, but I did read A Return to Love. And you just reminded me of one thing that you wrote that really stuck with me to this day, and it's been like 6 years. It was about a story, I think when you were dating, and the expectations you had of a man, for example, basically not committing as much as you wanted them to commit.
Yeah.
And it was like, your perspective, I'm not remembering it fully, but of being loving towards, this is just where he is in his life. And it was a full shift on perspective of being angry. I think when he called, you were like, great, nice to talk to you.
Oh, that's the guy.
Yeah,
No.
I love that story.
This is really interesting that you love that story.
Because it made me,
I think it says a lot about both of us that I wrote it and says something about you that you loved it. That was a chapter about forgiveness, okay?
Yes.
Now, I was 40 years old when that book came out.
Okay.
This shows you something about my life until that point, and it really says some things about the times in which it was written. I said in that book, I know about forgiveness. I know how hard it can be. I had this date with this guy. It was the Olympics in LA, and he was working for CNN, and we were supposed to have a date after, and he stood me up. I know how hard forgiveness is. Now, you and many people have said, I love that story. And it was about 20 years after I wrote that book that I read that, and I went, that is your example of something hard to forgive? But it's where we were.
You know what? I didn't look at it as forgive. I more looked at it as a perspective shift,
Yeah.
and I think it was symbolic to bigger things in life.
Yeah, well, definitely it was. Definitely was.
It
but I
wasn't,
would
like,
be
so
embarrassed to tell
literal.
that story now as a example of something really hard to forgive. But you're absolutely right. The principle is the same.
The principle.
When I came to realize that, number one, the guy had stood me up. Number two, no, he wasn't going to come the next morning with roses and say, please forgive me and take me to lunch. You know, and what that story is about, which is really the whole point, is what happens inside your head. So I kept repeating, I love you, Mike, and I think I called him Steve in the book. I love you, Steve, and I release you to the Holy Spirit. I love you, Steve, and I release you to the Holy Spirit. And I love you, Steve, and I release you to the Holy Spirit. And what that story is about is the fact that I did that so much in my head. It was like a mantra. I would do it silently, obviously, if I was with someone else. But so many times, even walking through the house, I forgive you, Steve, and I release you to the Holy Spirit. I forgive you, Steve, and I release you to the Holy Spirit. But by the time he called 2 weeks later, I was in this kind of, hi, how are you? And yet, when he started pulling in with all his own stuff, well, I missed you. I was like, laughed out loud inside myself. And when he said, could I see you? I went, no, but in a very friendly way, because I had been lifted. And so
I think it's, you know, and look, I've evolved past that. You know, I'm not dating anymore, but I do think that there's so many people listening who are very early on their spiritual path, and that's a connection point.
Well,
it
not
really,
only that,
you know,
and I don't mean to be glib about love and romantic, intimate relationships and how they can hook us in probably more than anything else. So you're absolutely right. I'm not saying those are easy. I just thought it was interesting looking back.
It
that
is funny,
that was
though.
what I used as an example of just how hard it can be to forgive.
You know, we've all been there, and it's funny that stuck with me. It is
Yeah,
interesting.
everybody said, oh, I love that story.
Yeah, you never know what's going to connect with people, right?
Yeah.
I do want to talk about, there's so much I want to talk about with your new book, The Mystic Jesus, but there's some, I think, first of all, even just the title of it. So, Jesus. I want to get into a few terms that you use in terms of just mystical terms that I think can kind of help the rest of the explanation. So let's just start with the first one, the mystic Jesus as opposed to the traditional historic Jesus.
I'm Jewish. Did I read that you were a convert to Judaism?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So
Actually,
you
haven't even
must-
shared that, but recently.
You must love Nobody Wants This.
Yeah, obsessed. The best. I was like, just like solidifies. It's funny though, I didn't grow up religious at all. So even converting was, I'm one of those people who like, I don't know any biblical
Now, were your parents
terms.
Muslim or Christian?
My parents were Muslim by culture, but never raised us practicing. My whole
Right.
family doesn't practice. So I grew up in America. My parents were divorced, so I didn't have a strong family. My dad and brother lived across the country in LA. I lived in New York with my mom. We celebrated Christmas, but I always wanted some kind of religious background just because I felt like I felt left out. So most people around me were Christian. And then I actually loved so much of what I learned about Judaism, but I'm more of a spiritual being than anything.
I think there's something very significant about that show. Something very, it clearly has hit a vein. And I think that vein has to do with how we see men. I think that there's been so much conversation about toxic masculinity. You know, I've talked about
I'm
this.
fatigued of that term a little bit.
Pardon?
I'm fatigued of that term.
I'm glad you're fatigued. The whole culture should be fatigued.
Yeah.
It is so overused as to be bigoted towards men at this point. But I think that, you know, I've said for a long time, and I actually talk about it in this book, that we talk about the divine feminine. Well, there's the divine masculine as well.
Yes, thank you.
And Germaine Greer, the famous feminist, said that the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, but fraternity. So I think in
Oh,
that,
wow.
so I think in that show, what has so spoken to people is that we yearn to like men, to love men, to see an example. I mean, we make a joke of it, right? He's the hot rabbi. Can a guy be hot, cool? You want to be there, and truly good. And basing his life in ethics and character and honesty and the search for the noble, the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the God of his understanding. We want that. We have so overdone it with embellishing our neuroses and our pathologies, and I feel very strongly about that, and it's particularly significant at the moment because we are called by this moment in history to be strong. This is not a moment for women to be little girls, not a moment for men to be little boys. And so we want to see examples. What does a fully self-actualized man or woman or fluid whatever look like? We have become so, in a way, over-attentive to our woundedness.
Yes. That's a really nice way to put it, because of course there's the process of healing, but it's like people are victimizing their trauma, and it's like you have to, deal with it and work through it and then move on from it.
Absolutely. And not only that, you can't wait till you're completely healed to move on from it. You live with it. And it becomes what Jean Houston calls your sacred wound. We will not make it as a species if the best and the brightest among us, which is basically everyone potentially, is waiting till we're enlightened masters to show up for the world. I remember I went through a tragic event in my life many years ago, and my cousin Martha said to me, "It will never go away, you will never forget, but your life will grow so big around it that it will find a peaceful place in your heart." One of the things that I have always loved is reading biographies of great historical figures. They weren't people who didn't have woundedness and despair. Abraham Lincoln, who was known for his depression, his melancholia, who, they thought that the Civil War was going to be over in 6 weeks. As it was it was a horrifying 4 years, 600,000 people died. And his private secretary kept a lot of notes. And one of the things that always stuck out for me was his secretary would come into his office and tell him how many men had died in a battle. And he would put his head in his hands and he would rock back and forth and say, "I cannot bear it.
That gave me chills.
I cannot bear it." So, we think of, we have these cardboard characters that we make of some of the people who have done truly great things. And no, they were human beings. And they lived with sometimes wounds and pain that most of us can't even imagine. But they kept going, and so must we. I always say, you pray in the morning, you kick ass in the afternoon. We have the times you need. You have your sacred friends. You go through your processing. You have to heal. I think I truly do understand. And I really understand this year. But the seasons change. In my book, I wrote a book called Tears to Triumph. And I opened it with a poem from Rilke, where he says, "Let me not squander the hour of my pain." See, that's a problem. Jung said that all neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering. One of the reasons it's so wrong-minded to make such a mountain out of a molehill, to call everything a trauma, is that then we're not capable of being present when we or someone else has really gone through one. It's like we're so, putting mustard and relish on things that you're a grown up and you move through it and you integrate it and that we're not noticing truly serious, brutal traumas that are around us, and sometimes they're even our own.
I know there's this term people use, big T, little t. Have you heard that? Yeah.
No,
yeah.
no, I haven't, but
they're
that's
like
good.
Little
Big trauma, little
Yeah,
good.
but
Good,
I
that's-
do. Maybe
good.
that's
I
good,
had not
right?
heard that. That's exactly what I would be referring to. Yes.
I think Gabby Bernstein. I've heard her say it. I'm not sure if she coined it or not.
Good. Good.
I do want to go back to the
Oh,
mystic
okay,
Jesus. I want to.
Okay, so I'm Jewish, and when I first saw A Course in Miracles here in New York many years ago, I had studied comparative religion in college. So I had read Christian theology, St. Augustine, St. Thomas of Aquinas, Teresa of Avila. I had read quite a bit and enjoyed it and liked it. But when I saw this book on a coffee table here in New York, it was like, no, this is my personal life. Because I opened it, I was fascinated. It didn't have anybody written on the title, on the cover, which today isn't that unusual. But then you never had seen that. And this amazing introduction, and I started leafing through it. I saw the Christian language, and I thought, I mean, I wasn't taught anything about those terms. It's like you said, you weren't raised. I was raised with a deep sense of relationship to God. But when it came to the New Testament, because we were Jewish, all my mother ever said was, we don't read that one, honey. We read the other book.
Okay.
So Jesus himself, Jews don't have a problem with Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. We have a problem with Christianity historically at certain times, but can you blame them, right? I mean, hello, Inquisition and so forth. So when I started reading the Course a year later, you learn very quickly this is not a religion. It makes it very clear. It is a psychological mind training. It calls itself in the relinquishment of a thought system based on fear and the acceptance instead of a thought system based on love. And it uses these traditional Christian terms, but in non-traditional, psychotherapeutically oriented ways. It actually says at one point that at their peak, psychotherapy and religion become one, because we're just talking about a healing of the mind. In moments when it says, do not conform to the patterns of the world, have a renewal of your mind. When Jesus spoke and said, my kingdom is not of this world, Freud had not been born yet. People didn't have, well, certainly great artists and philosophers always had a sense of the inner life. But there was no conceptualization of it the way there would be in the modern era. So now we read something like, my kingdom is not of this world, it's in your psyche. It's not of this world, it's of this world. So I read in the Course, reading about Jesus, I came to understand, first of all, I came to understand nobody's asking you to change religion, Marianne. And I began to realize that which he is, if looked within the expanded context of metaphysical understanding, is so much bigger than just the historical figure, which is not to minimize the historical figure. It's not to minimize or in any way disrespect the ecclesiastic traditions of the Christian religion. This is not about that. This is just about saying that as we have evolved in our understanding, then the Gnostic or mystical understanding is not just who he was 2,000 years ago, but who he is right here, right now, as a name on a door, which is a portal within us to that great evolutionary leap. And then he, like Buddha, like Moses, like many other great religious avatars, become those mutations, become the self-actualized potential. So he says in the Course in Miracles, I am in a state that is only potential in you. I don't have anything that you don't have, he says. The difference between us is that I don't have anything else. So Jesus in the Course, it's like the Jesus of the Christian religion has for many, not for everyone, but for many has become kind of musty. People want to know about Jesus, but they don't want the dogma and the doctrine, much of which doesn't work for people. They go, but they don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. They don't mean to be disconnecting from God, and they don't even mean to turn away from Jesus. There's a compelling figure there for many of our hearts. But it's like, show him to me outside the box. And that's what the Course in Miracles is, and that's what this book is about. The idea that Jesus is someone who lived on the earth And while here, completely actualized the divine consciousness, which is potential within us all. And having done so, we're taught, has been authorized by God to help the rest of us get there if we want. So, for instance, when you and I were talking about we're angry at someone, let's say, you and I might have lunch, right? And either one of us might say to the other, I'm just so pissed at so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And we would say to each other, let's say you had said that, and I might say to you, oh, come on, Mona, you're bigger than that, lighten up. And you go, thanks for reminding me, we'll let that go. But it might be something where it's not so simple as that, where that person really triggered something, or really harmed you in physical terms, or really betrayed you, or harmed someone that you love. At which point, getting through the wall that stands as a barrier in front of your heart is more than you can achieve by yourself. So he says in the Course, he says, my mind joined with your mind can chine away the ego. He can't take that from you if you don't ask, because that would be a violation of your free will. But Jesus becomes an internal teacher. The Course calls him an internal teacher, a kind of evolutionary elder brother. And if at moments like that we say, I'm willing, he says, I'll help you. And things begin to happen, and we begin to, I remember once when I happened to be in Europe with my family. When I was young, I was like probably in my late 20s or early 30s. And my mother and I at that point had this tension. She wanted a more conservative daughter, and I wanted a hipper mother. I didn't see it that way at the time, but that's what I came to understand. And there's a part in the Course where it says, that you're on this earth to learn to think as God thinks. Think about what you're thinking about someone God would not be thinking. Think what God is thinking that you are not. And we were on this bus, and it was one of those buses where you're, across from each other. And I looked at my mother, and I said a little prayer. I'm willing to see her differently. And I had almost like this daydream moment. I saw her as a little girl, like a little tow-headed. I'd seen a picture of her. Just for a moment, I saw her as a little, like, 5-year-old. And in that moment, and I remember thinking, yeah, God's not looking and saying, Sophiane is such a bitch. It's not how God is thinking about it, Marianne. And so the Course says, your pain is not anything she has said or done to you. Your pain is that in response to her closing her heart to you, you have closed your heart to her. That's the only thing that can cause you pain. It's like I remember that famous story about the Tibetan who had been in a Chinese prison for many years and had been tortured there. And a journalist or someone had said, what was your greatest fear being there? And the Tibetan monk said, my greatest fear was that this would make me hate him. So Jesus is someone who's already made it through. That's the meaning in the Course of the crucifixion. The crucifixion was the last useless journey. It is now in the field that we all share, because the metaphysical, mystical meaning of there is only one begotten Son is the idea that we're all it. So once anybody has achieved something, it's a potential for everyone. It's like in sports, when somebody sets a record, it's done. It's somebody pushed through, right? And so the idea here is, as someone who lived with such purity of love, love self-corrects the universe, love corrects the universe. He got there so fully that even unto death itself, the correction occurred. So now, no matter what we go through, he says, I don't need you to join me in the crucifixion. I need you to join me in the resurrection. Don't stay in those places where, yes, your ego, they've done it to you, they're mean to you, they don't like you, you don't have the money, you're breaking up, you're bankrupt, all that stuff happens. But the consciousness in the midst of the crucifixion paves the way Now, it still takes that proverbial symbolic 3 days. We're human. We go through a process, but remaining in a willingness to love ourselves and others, to atone for our own mistakes, which are usually operative there in those situations. Love others, forgive, do that inner work. The universe will begin again. Now, what I find so fascinating about that resurrection, which the Course says is the return to your right mind, where you see that only love is real. I love how when the women went to get the body, the angels, the thoughts of God, tell the women, he isn't here, he has risen. Now, this is what I love about that. At the end of the process, you've achieved forgiveness of yourself and others, you've processed through this, you're not the same person anymore. You're not in that cave. Not the you you had to go into that cave of your own healing and processing. The person you are on the other end of that is not even the same person. You have risen. You have grown. Something has been alchemized inside you. So you see these terms like the Holy Spirit, the connecting link between you and your divine and God. Jesus as your evolutionary elder brother. The birth of Christ as the birth of your own selfhood at its next level. Mary being the humanity within us, that divine feminine. God impregnates her. Then Joseph becomes that divine masculine. Get her out of town, she's unsafe here. Take care of her on the earth plane. And then out of your humanity impregnated by God, you become a different person. And that different person is the salvation of the world. Look at the world. That place where we will find a way to not live on this planet the way we are living now, because the way we are living now is unsustainable. And then the only thing I will add to that is look at the word salvation. It's like everything is so different because the only thing to be saved from is our own fear-based negative thinking and lovelessness.
So I think one of my questions I was going to ask was the differentiation in the book between Jesus and God, and why are we not just referring to him as God? But now I'm understanding he's not God, he's a big brother.
That's right.
Okay.
He says all should be used only in talking about God. I actually have that in the very beginning of the book, that quote. He says all implies inequality. He said, that's where he says, I don't have anything you don't have. The only difference between us is I don't have anything else. I'm in a state which is only potential in you.
So when you're saying, look, let's say, I've prayed to God to help me release fears that I have.
Right.
Should I be asking Jesus?
Well, first of all, nobody's up there going, Mona, get the words right, or we're not even talking.
That's true.
Get the words right. No, you say.
I love to be literal about it.
No, you say what you say. You know, just pray for a miracle, and you know, whether it's.
So does it matter in that sense? Is it
No,
God, Jesus? Is it like
words are but symbols? But if you're going to talk about theological construct, it is what we would call a Trinitarian system. There is the Father, there is the Son, there is the Holy Ghost. So let's talk about why. The Course in Miracles says we are ideas in the mind of God, and that God is all that is. So if God creates something, he can't create something other than himself. God is an idea, a mind of love, and so we are a thought he has thought. The only difference between us, the Course says, is that God created us, but we did not create him. Now, at the moment, when millions of years ago, in time as we know it, the Course says, which itself is pretty fascinating, someone forgot to laugh, someone disconnected from love. The Course in Miracles says that God has an answer to every problem the moment the problem occurs, but God would not force you back to love because love does not force. So in that moment, the Course says he created an eternal communication link between himself and his separated sons. Different religions. In Judaism, that is the covenant of Israel. So these are universal spiritual themes, that there's a rope that connects us, right? Depending on the religious orientation, it can be seen differently, what that covenant is, whatever it is. And the practice is always the same, the atonement, Yom Kippur, Easter, it's all the same, right? And the Course in Miracles says that Jesus is someone whose mind was so purified by the Holy Spirit, or the communication link, that they have become as one. So to pray to one is to pray to the other, to call on one. And the Course in Miracles says that they respond fully to your slightest invitation. Now, God, if we want to get really theological about it, God knows none of this is happening. This is all, the Course in Miracles says, only love is real. This is a giant hallucination. It is what is called illusion in the Course. It was called illusion in Buddhism, Maya or illusion. Einstein said time and space are but illusions of consciousness, albeit persistent ones. So it's like God is just grooving with you where you're fine, all is bliss, but we are incarnated in a world where, as the Course says, illusions are as powerful in their effects as is the truth. So there's this wall. There's Mona in this perfect bliss, everything's fabulous because none of this is even happening that's not love. And then there's Mona going through her earthly existence, right? And you might go through something where you're very confused, you can't, our wires get crossed. We're human, where we don't know how to express our love and get our needs met, somebody's behavior, some conflict, some whatever. The Holy Spirit is like standing on the wall, knows the real you, knows what you're going through here. If you say, and once again, calling the Holy Spirit is calling Jesus, calling Jesus, calling the Holy Spirit, I am willing, then it goes, song lyric, conversation with a friend, a book, a teacher, a movie, a thought you have when you meditate. There's a story about this that I tell in the book. Should I tell you?
Please.
I always laugh. I think that this was the 80s. I had already started lecturing, but I was wearing acrylic fingernails. And a woman who came to my lectures put on the acrylic fingernails, and I used to go to her apartment to do it. One day, I'm there, and my hands, she's doing my fingernails, and she has friends there. And there are women that I don't know, like 3 or 4 women. And one of the women talked in a way that made me wildly judgmental. It was like fingernails on a blackboard. There was something about her tone of voice. I thought, why is a chick talking like that? I mean, it's so weird. It sounded so affected to me. But then I thought, how ironic, because this woman holding my hands right now doesn't expect me to be thinking like this, right? She comes to my Course in Miracles lectures. Right. She thinks I'm Miss Love, so I really shouldn't have such bitchy thoughts. So I said to God, inside my heart, I said, I am willing to see this differently. Within, I don't know, was it 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, I don't know, pretty right away. One of the other women said to that woman, is it true what I heard? They're going to let your father out of prison? Now, I'm just sitting listening. This young woman, I'm 20s, 30s, I don't know, had been raised, well, she hadn't been raised, is the point. She and her brother had been essentially raised in a dungeon, where they had been put by their father into their basement for their entire childhood.
Oh my God.
It was like one of those stories you see on television. Mm-hmm. And just listening, I'm learning that she didn't know how to talk. When they got her, she didn't know how to talk. She was like 18, I know. And the same sounds that 10 minutes before I had judged so harshly, I was overcome with admiration for this woman. She was learning to talk as an adult. Wow. No, she hadn't changed. I had changed. I had changed. The Course says you think you're going to understand someone well enough to know whether they're worthy of your love. But it says, until you love them, you cannot understand them. So that was a very, I tell that story in that book. It brings tears to my eyes even now, that I went from to just, her bravery and her effort and the horror of what her life had been.
You took a question actually for me before I could even ask it, which was, what do you do in those moments? Because when I'm walking down the street, I find myself judging all the time, but I'm so deep in my spiritual practice now, the last 3 years, that I catch it right away and I stop myself and I ask myself, like, why am I judging? And I think I've heard the term, really, I'm judging myself if I'm judging them. But it was like, what do I do? Because something isn't clicking yet to get me out of that moment.
Well, even when you're judging because you're judging. Your human experience was your human experience. Just don't do it. Just replace the tape. Don't try to figure out why you're doing it. That's just an ego mechanism. Just stop and go, Jesus or God, whatever has me here to love that person. If you really think about what people are going through, I often say at my lectures, I could say it here in this room, but I've said it in rooms really big. You could think of everybody in this room could think of the worst pain and the worst suffering that they've ever been through, right? And then I'll say, got that in your mind? Got that in your mind? It is statistically reasonable to assume that the person to your right has suffered that much as well. It is statistically reasonable to think that the person to your left has suffered that much as well. The person to your right and the person behind you. All of a sudden, it's a different room. If you would say, why am I judging? It's because you're up there and the ego mind judges. That's what the ego does, to make sure that you feel separate from others so that you will be in pain. That's all that's going on here. Your pain is the ego mind's peak experience, and it perpetuates your pain by having you separate yourself from others from whom you cannot be separate, except on this level, when in fact there is no place where you start and I stop. So James Doty, this wonderful writer of a book called Into the Magic Shop, he's a neurosurgeon at Stanford, and he talks about how they have discovered that there's a highway of sorts between the brain and the heart that they didn't used to know was there, that they now see as the intelligence center of the body. And it's also the intelligence center of civilization. The reason you're judging those people is because you're in the ego mind, and you replace the ego mind, drop down, go into your heart. And if you think of the worst moments of your suffering, and you really allow yourself to realize they have suffered that much too, then you start having compassion for people. My father used to say, my father was born in poverty. My father lived his childhood in real poverty. I used to hear a story when my dad was in his 20s, I think, and he had a quarter. And he was so happy because he was going to be able to get some food. And he dropped the quarter. And he watched it go across the room, and he wasn't able to get it before it fell into a hole. I must have heard that story 10 times growing up. But this is what my father used to do. We'd go somewhere like a 7-Eleven or anywhere like that, and there would be somebody mopping the floor or somebody taking out the trash or somebody doing some other menial job. And my father said, kids, come here. See that person? His life is very hard. Or her life is very hard. I mean, if you really, the Course in Miracles says only what you are not giving can be lacking in any situation. You don't know what people are going through or working in this building.
When I think about moments that I'm judging, right, and it's like someone's being aggressive towards their dog or like really screaming at their kid, and I think you almost feel in that moment that you have a right, you're judging because you're the nicer person or like they're doing something wrong, but it's not true. You're not really thinking.
Well, I don't think that this means we don't hold people accountable.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if somebody is doing anything towards their kid that's uncool, the best thing is for them to know you're watching. Best thing is that if you see somebody on the street and they're not being cool with a child, absolutely, make it obvious you're watching. Because that says to them, be careful. If I see anything against that child, that's not cool. So this is not about not holding people accountable. I mean, on one hand, yes, that person has their own issues from childhood or woundedness or whatever, they're overwhelmed that they would be grabbing that little child, but that's not an excuse to grab that little child. Mm-hmm. So it's a paradox, but I'm just trying to say that non-judgment does not mean not holding people accountable.
Yes, and of course I understand that distinction. I think there's also something to be said about women, you know, like loving everybody and being kind and being open. But then there's like this protection that women have to have, right? Because I find I've gone through periods where I'm like, let me smile at people more, let me be, but then you almost invite in certain things. And where is that balance between protecting your energy?
Well, beautiful women learn, or should learn, to have invisibility cloaks, particularly married women or women who are with partners. And an invisibility cloak is, I'm loving you from a very high chakra. So you shut down certain chakras. It's all on that level of internal sorcery and not open for anybody crossing a boundary. It becomes in your field. It doesn't mean, though, that you shut down your love, because in fact, the Course in Miracles says you create what you defend against. So you actually attract harshness if there's harshness in your field.
I've never heard that, and that's just very eye-opening, because I think it's just a great way to draw that boundary and that line. Mm-hmm. It is something I've struggled with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you put on your invisibility cloak before you leave the apartment.
What is it about this book that made you want to write it right now? And like, what would you want people to learn from this book versus A Return to Love or any of your other books?
In some ways, I see it as the sequel to Return to Love. I think when it was, this book was actually written because my publisher called me and said, he said, you know, we get calls from booksellers saying people come into bookstores requesting a book about Jesus, but they don't want to give me a book about Jesus that's not about Christianity. He said, could you write that book? Which I thought was pretty funny, because I am a Jew and I'm a student of the Course in Miracles, and there's nothing in there about converting to a religion or anything like that. And I think I always had hoped that maybe someday I would write a book about Jesus. And I think that we're living at a time, which you said when you opened up our conversation, of such urgency. The Course in Miracles does not speak of an exclusive Jesus. The Course says he's not the only name on the door. If he is on the door for you, you know it. But I think, so some people would read that book and know he's the name on the door for me, whether they see themselves as Christians or not. Some would go, this is really great. He's not the name on the door for me. I read books about Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist, but you know, the thing about truth is that it's one. You know, we were talking before about being Muslim. All the great religious systems have their mystical traditions. Sufism, the Kabbalah, Gnostic Christianity. A Course in Miracles is, I see it as part of a long legacy of the mystic, Christ-centered views. I grew up at a time where, when I was in college, for instance, we used to read Ram Dass and Alan Watts in the morning, and we would go to Vietnam anti-war protests in the afternoon. It was a time of such countercultural change. It was sexual, it was musical, it was spiritual, it was political. Nobody had this concept of stay in your lane. Nobody said, well, your wellness, your spirituality, religion, your politics. We're multidimensional people. And that has really divided us and separated us from aspects of ourselves. So I experienced a lot of that with I would write about spiritual books and say, well, she just wouldn't talk about politics. Or with political people, she just wouldn't go on and on about that spiritual stuff. It's like, fortunately, I think we're all evolving beyond that. We need to take an integrative look at changing the world right now. No different than in health, right? There are external things, but there are very important internal things to prevent the disease and to help ameliorate it should it arrive. That's how I understand. Such work is yours. And so if you learn these principles in any area, then you more easily apply them in every area. And I think right now, even like when you look at the wellness, I was very active in the AIDS crisis. And that was when, in the United States, we began to embrace the paradigm. First, we called it complementary medicine. First, they called it alternative medicine. Then we called it complementary medicine. They finally landed at energy medicine. You'd probably tell me now it would be more like functional or energy medicine?
It depends. There's energy, there's functional. I mean, integrative ties them both together.
Okay. To whatever extent I understand that, I feel my field has been taking those exact same principles and applying them to social and political change. And I think that's where we are as a society. And I think when you learn how life operates, just how life operates in nature, in the body, in society, then we become adepts, right? And I think that there's an aspect of this society, in fact, in terms of politics, someone might say to you, no, you're the wellness lady, and you've really got that, and you're this beautiful woman, so you don't really, you stay out of that. And I think people are realizing, no. What's going on this planet right now? No, we all have to be involved. But we don't have to surrender what we've learned about the deepest regions of life. I think people who are involved in wellness, spirituality, personal growth, people who are involved in personal growth, spirituality, wellness, and so forth, are the last people who should be sitting out the great societal questions, political, economic, and so forth, for the very reason that if you know what changes one life, you're the one who knows what would change the world. And that's where I feel we're on a great frontier, because an old order and an old mode of problem solving has failed. It is an inadequate response to the crises of this moment, and I think it's our turn.
I think it's really interesting too that I know we're talking about 20th century, 21st century, of the older version being looking at things systematically and like a machine. But really, if you go back, people did look at it way back, right?
This so really, what modern world calls traditional is just aberrational.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going back to traditional.
Yes, and I think for me, when my journey into health and wellness, I got my doctorate in pharmacy and I worked as a pharmacist. Didn't like it. I was living in LA at the time and just immersed in the wellness scene around me. And then I got into, first I was plant-based, then it was clean eating, and then spirituality just comes along with it because you're into health, right? So you're taking care of your mind. Then the more spiritual, I always used to say, I'm vegan for health, not necessarily all animal because I do still wear leather. But then as you get spiritual, you care a lot about the animals. Then I was like, I'm not really an environmentalist, I just eat clean. But the more, I have this plant that I'm like, feel connected to. It was starting to die and I brought it back to life and I'm like, okay, now this plant has this consciousness and I feel responsible for it. So it's like you just go down this path and it's all connected.
It all starts sparkling.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to me too. It's like, how can I see it here and then close my eyes to it over there? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And civilization is like that dying plant.
Yeah, and it was, I remember this plant was dying and I've never kept a plant alive before, but I just felt called to try.
Yeah.
And I watered it and the next day it was night and day difference. And I was like, okay, so you think something's broken. I could have just thrown it out, but it's almost like in the body, everything, I'm working on fascia and like the hip is connected to the knee, which is connected to your ankle. And it's just symbolic of everything being connected. The more you raise your consciousness, the more you realize all of it matters.
I remember a doctor in Los Angeles, Dr. Soram Khalsa, you might have known him. He died not long ago. But I remember him saying to me many years ago, your body wants to be healthy. Mm-hmm. Your body wants to be healthy. Feed it that which will make you healthy. Do for it that which will make you healthy. We're not going to just use allopathic remedies to suppress or eradicate the symptoms. Nourish the body. Nourish a child. Nourish a community. It wants to be healthy. That is the natural way.
You say in the book about practicing your attitudinal muscle, is that what you call it? Obviously, there's so many practical tips, but this is really just using your mind as if it's a muscle in your body, because
That's right. Morning is so important. I talk about that in the book. And working your attitudinal muscles is no different than working your physical muscles. At a certain age, if you're not holding the muscles up, they're headed down. So what do? You do constant repetitions of anti-gravity, and it builds them up. Well, there's internal gravity, anger, negativity, especially at a time like this. So just like you exercise your physical muscles so you can move, you exercise your internal musculature through prayer, through meditation, through reflectiveness. Blaise Pascal said, every problem in the world stems from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. You work on this musculature in order to retain and develop your capacity to be still, to be non-reactive. Sometimes just don't say anything. Don't send a text. Don't tweet. Don't just find your center first. And that is as important an ability to control your inner self and find your non-reactive capacity. That's as important as learning to do this or do that. It's equally important to learn to be still when it's time to be still, because that's when you can hear the voice for God, which is a term they use in both Judaism and Christianity, the small, still voice for God. And you gain wisdom and insight that you just can't when the cacophony of the world is assaulting you the way it does today with social media and everything.
It really is a muscle you train, because I started meditating probably 8 years ago, but it wasn't until 3 years ago that I felt like something really strengthened. And now, even in the last year, I'm at a point where I can choose what I want to do every morning. I was a little rigid about it, where I was like, I have to put my timer for this many minutes and do this thing. And sitting still, it's so peaceful now. And I'm just curious what your morning routine is, if you have the same meditation practice.
I am a Course in Miracles student, and so I don't want to say religious, because of course it's not a religion, but I am disciplined. And it's interesting, the word disciple and discipline come from the same root. I am disciplined about the workbook of the Course in Miracles every morning. I also do transcendental meditation, but I don't do it all the time. I'm not disciplined with that, but I am disciplined with the workbook of the Course in Miracles.
And are you like an evening? Do you have a spiritual practice at night?
The most important thing is the morning, because the morning is when your mind is most open to receive new impressions. If you wake up in the morning and go directly to social media or email or the news of the world, good luck not being depressed by noon, because it'll eat you alive. But if we will do that in the morning, I know friends tell me, do this before your coffee. Sometimes I achieve that, sometimes I don't achieve that, but I'm pretty good about knowing that if I don't do that in the morning, my head's not where it needs to be to face the day.
Absolutely. I actually, as someone whose primary job is on social media, I don't open social media till probably 11 a.m. I have it planned the night before. It just makes in the days that I do, I'm noticeably less happy.
Right, and people who know me know she's not up yet. I need my time in the morning.
Yes.
Big time.
What about your health and wellness routine? When you as you got deeper into your spiritual practice, did it change, or were you always?
I always tried pretty hard But as I get older, I'm trying even harder. You know, you start thinking about things when you are older, and you start, you know, things that you took for granted at 50, especially brain health.
I think about that now as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so because of that, you know, kind of glass of Sauvignon Blanc has fallen aside, to the wayside. Like, I have a greater sense of that now with food, and yeah.
Is there anything, well, I'm sure writing this book has got to be a therapeutic process. Is there something that you discovered, or any lesson that you had while writing it that was profound to you, or any kind of aha moment? Or was it just more reiterating?
Have you written your first book yet?
I'm actually in the process of just starting.
Oh, congratulations.
I haven't written a book
If I
yet.
can help in any way, please let me know.
Thank you.
I wish the book was longer. I look at it now, and there'll be chapters, and I go, oh, I wish I had done more with it. I wish I had expanded on that chapter, or written more prayers there. I subscribe to Hemingway's comment about how when the book is no longer writing itself, put the pencil down. So I feel that you get pregnant with a book, and then when it's time for it to be born, it starts sort of writing itself. And it's just an honor and a pleasure. And also, I think another thing, as I've gotten older, I became successful as a writer because of Oprah Winfrey so early in my career that I took it for granted. And now the fact that anybody's still, I've been out there so long, that anybody still wants to hear anything I have to say, I think blown away by it is maybe a little too strong, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful. You know, when you're young, things come so easy. And, you know, in my book, my second book was a book about women, A Woman's Worth. And I quote this German writer who said, in youth you learn, in age you understand. You get to a point in your life where you're spinning all the, you know, when you're younger, thinking about the future, when you're older, it's like, oh my God, what did I just go through over the last 50 years? You know, people talk about investigating their childhood. You get to an age where you're investigating your adulthood. You know, what's happened since your childhood.
That's a good point.
That level of inquiry was very much with me when I wrote this book. I think the Course in Miracles says people hear you on the level that you speak from. It's like when you and I were talking before the cameras rolled. I said, if it's interesting to you and me, it'll be interesting to someone else. It's, you know, if you don't find your passion, and that's really all you need to remember with your book, what's really passionate for you. And if you're not passionate about it, put it down, close the computer, start again the next day. And to find that place and be in that place. And when we're not in that place, go do something else.
That's great advice. Thank you. It's hard to sum up one message from the book, but what would you want readers to get from this book? Just what would be one of the most important takeaways, one of many, I'm sure?
That we're not alone. And that miracles occur naturally as expressions of love, and that there is no order of difficulty in miracles. And that when we are in doubt or in fear, as many people are right now, you can reach out your hand, as would a child that says for a little elder brother, and that elder brother will help you across those rocks. And he says in the Course, I assure you, this is no idle fantasy. Consider the possibility. You know, the Course says, you can take these ideas as like toys, just look at them like toys. They'll have the effect of toys in your life. But if you look at such principles as these, as the dynamics and the forces which rule universes, so shall they be for you. I think we've been so outer-oriented and are paying a terrible price for the imbalance. Just as you And just as you've seen miracles with your plant, with people working with you, I think as a writer, my hope as a writer, my hope is when I speak to audiences, is that somebody leaves there thinking, I'd never thought about it that way. And in my political involvement as well, the Course in Miracles says salvation begins when you consider the possibility there might be a better way. Whether it's with our bodies, with our food, with our health, with our relationships, living on the earth, there's a better way. And my hope is that I, in my own way, contribute in some level, in some way, to people considering that possibility, as I do.
I think you just saying this, I really think is going to give people hope, because I know for me in the beginning of my spiritual journey, I was like, oh, I wish I could be that connected. There's going to take so many reps and years for me to be there. But you're like, just
Next moment.
Yeah, in a moment. That's exciting, too.
And it's always just the person in front of you. It's not when I meet some other person in some other situation. It's the person in front of you. Am I showing up as best I can and holding a space for them to be the best they can? That's all it is. There's nothing more complicated than that. And then in the next moment, are you showing up as best you can?
And coming back to it when you're not.
Yeah, and knowing, well, I'm human, and...
Yep. So, okay,
Truth is simple. Life is complicated. Bring the simple to the complicated, and we'll all get there.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This is an amazing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. It was lovely being with you.